Many of you watching this will know Nvidia as something of a gamer's champion, a company which releases newer, faster graphics cards every year that allows us to enjoy the latest and greatest games. Some of you will believe that, but let me tell you about the real Nvidia. Did you ever wonder where the name Nvidia came from? It's a very clever name, with a clear connotation to the word video, but the word Nvidia in Latin also means envy, which as you may know is one of the Christian 7 deadly sins, and clearly envy is an undesirable trait, so you may think that this is just sheer coincidence. But envy, jealousy, is also known as the green eye, the green-eyed monster, and that would be 2 coincidences, which is something I don't believe in. Nvidia was founded in April 1993 by Chris Malachowski, Curtis Priem, and ex-AMD engineer Jensen Huang, who today is still president and CEO of the company. And back in 1993, the green eye, Nvidia, looked jealously on the graphics card market and desired it all for itself. Nvidia is a designer of integrated circuits, with the vast majority of these designs based around graphics, but they never manufactured their own chips. In 1994, Nvidia formed their first strategic partnership with SGS Thomson, better known today as ST Microelectronics, or simply called ST. Today, ST are Europe's largest semiconductor chip maker. In 1995, Nvidia launched its first product, the NV1, manufactured, of course, by ST. The NV1 was a complete 2D and 3D graphics core, integrated sound card, and also included a joypad port. The chip found limited success in the Diamond Edge 3D card, and Nvidia had gambled on quadrilaterals in an attempt to cozy up to Sega, who used the same format in their Saturn game console. Although the NV1's performance was capable, it was just too difficult to develop for, while also being very expensive due to the sound card and joystick ports. NV1, like the Saturn, faded rather quickly into obscurity. Nvidia's fortunes changed, however, in 1997 with the launch of their Riva 128 accelerator. Still manufactured at ST, the Riva 128 was designed for DirectX, and by this stage Nvidia had ditched quadratic texture mapping for the industry standard triangles. The Riva 128 succeeded where NV1 failed, and with 1 million units sold in the first 4 months after launch, Nvidia soon found themselves in need of a larger manufacturing partner. And so, in 1998, Nvidia formed a multi-year strategic partnership with the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company TSMC. And from February 1998, and for the next 20 years plus, TSMC would assist in the manufacturing of all future Nvidia products, starting with the Riva 128 ZX. But Nvidia's success with Riva had not gone unnoticed, and the company soon attracted unwelcome patent lawsuits. First of all from Silicon Graphics, who claimed that Nvidia's Riva processors violated their texture cache memory and texture interpolation logic on one chip, a patent developed by an engineer who subsequently left to join Nvidia. A couple of months later, S3 were also at it, claiming that Nvidia's Riva family of graphics processors infringed upon 3 separate video patents. And then later in 1998, Nvidia's third rival 3DFX slapped yet another patent infringement suit on the company, alleging that Nvidia had incorporated 3DFX's multi-texturing technology in its own products. Nvidia's response was swift and telling. First of all, settling the patent case with SGI, with the companies cross-licensing each other's patent portfolios and SGI dismissing its suit. Nvidia then countersued S3, a vague patent focusing on audio, with an S3 representative saying that this lawsuit was simply a negotiation tactic to get S3 to settle on the outstanding graphics patent suit filed against Nvidia in 1998. As it turns out, a successful tactic, as S3 and Nvidia both dropped their lawsuits, before also going on to license each other's patents. And then finally, on the same day 3DFX announced a huge financial loss, Nvidia also sued them in what the press called a tactical lawsuit revenge. And that was enough to tip 3DFX over the edge, with Nvidia acquiring the graphics pioneer and all of their intellectual property. Years later, in 2006, we found out that SGI, Silicon Graphics, around the same time that the Nvidia deal was sealed, SGI canned the internal high-end graphics team, with only around 1 in 10 surviving. if that, while also telling the low-end graphics team that Nvidia would be paying their salaries while they finished their death march, and afterwards they would be Nvidia employees. That was part of the Nvidia settlement. Along with the cross-licensing of IP, it effectively meant that SGI was exiting any meaningful graphics hardware development for the first time. And going back to 1993, where Nvidia boasts that by 2006, Nvidia was the only independent still operating. What this didn't tell you was the way in which they achieved it, which involved countersuing, cross-licensing, and snapping up the cream of their rivals' engineering talent, or simply the whole company. By the turn of the century, Nvidia had shown themselves to be absolutely merciless in dealings with their competition. And Nvidia once again showed this in no uncertain terms at the beginning of 2001, when their now ex-manufacturing partner, STMicro, signed up with Hercules to produce the Cairo 2 graphics card. Now, Hercules were a very old name in computer graphics, formed in 1982 in California. They had started fading into relative obscurity by the end of the 90s and were no longer a major player in the graphics arena, and Nvidia were said to be unconcerned about this move. Although the Cairo 2 was a pretty good chip, using tile-based rendering over a decade before Nvidia incorporated the same technology, but Nvidia's claims of being unconcerned did not match their actions, as witnessed by this leaked 12-page hit piece titled Cairo 2, What You Should Know. And it starts by saying that the Cairo 2 is old. It is very old. A beefed up Cairo designed back in 1997, designed for DX6, not DX8. While being designed by a committee with an unproven record. And throughout this document, Nvidia had cherry-picked some of the less flattering comments on the Cairo 2 taken from certain reviews across the web. Including from Sharky Extreme's review, there are caveats to buying such a card. For one, the feature set is relatively dated, while also going on to say that Cairo 2 will look and perform terrible on new games, and also citing the AnandTech review of the card, where AnandTech said reviewers were supplied 175 MHz boards on a chip that is only spec'd to run at 166 MHz. In the conclusion, Nvidia stated the GeForce 2 MX is cheaper, more fully featured, has a brand name, has proven drivers, and is available now. And that buying the Cairo 2 is a risk, and when cards and PCs get returned, it damages your finances and your reputation. 12 pages of FUD on a single graphics card from a tiny, struggling manufacturer. But most telling of all in this entire document was this. When Nvidia cited their old partner, SGS Thomson, as having a poor record with complex design. Nvidia more than happy to throw their old partners under the bus when their usefulness had run out. As far as the presentation claims of Cairo 2 being designed by a committee with an unproven record, the Register disagreed with that. The Power VR family has been highly rated in the past, and it was chosen by Sega for the Dreamcast console. The Register also points out that essentially Nvidia spins the data to suggest flaws and failings with Cairo 2 in order to stress the superiority of its own GeForce 2 MX part. With the article concluding, of course Nvidia has every right to point out why its products are better than our rivals, but it's rather poor to rely on dissing them directly, and the company does seem to have overstepped the mark a bit here, particularly since its market lead is hardly threatened by the rival part. Nvidia gets more like Intel every day. 2 years later, graphics pioneer Hercules were also out of the market. Barely a year after their Cairo 2 FUD campaign, Nvidia were back with their GeForce 4 series, committing the same crimes they had accused Hercules of the year before. The GeForce 4 series comprised of two chips, NV17 and NV25. NV25 is perhaps the more famous TI series of cards, like your 4400 and your 4600 Ti. NV17, however, something much less impressive, because the NV17 core lacked all of the DX8 pixel and vertex shader units that made the original GeForce 3 what it was, meaning that NV17 would basically be a GeForce 2 MX. As AnandTech noted, luckily Nvidia decided against calling this the GeForce 3 MX. Unfortunately, they stuck with the name GeForce 4 MX, even more misleading to those that aren't well informed, as it gives the impression that the card at least has the minimal set of features that the GeForce 3 had, which it doesn't. This GeForce 4 naming convention for what was basically a GeForce 2 feature level card caused great consternation amongst gamers game developers. The reason for that is simple. Well over 80% of all graphics cards sold at this time were priced under $200. And since that was the market that the GeForce 4 MX was after, should the product succeed, then a great deal of that 80% plus of the market would not have DX8 support. Just like the Cairo 2 a year ago, and that simply meant that developers would be less inclined to support those features in their games. And despite harsh criticism by gaming enthusiasts, the GeForce 4 MX range was a market success, rapidly replacing the GeForce 2 MX as the best-selling GPU. And Nvidia's decision to segment the market with what was basically a rebranded GeForce 2 simply held back the development of new gaming technologies. Now, those of you paying attention back in 2000 maybe noticed this Xbox. And obviously Microsoft had chosen Nvidia as the graphics chip provider for the very first Xbox console. However, it wasn't long before things started going awry, with shipments falling far short of their original targets. And it was even less time before both Microsoft and Nvidia headed off to the courts over a disagreement on the pricing of the Xbox processors. In the end, in 2003, they did settle, with both companies working together on future cost reductions. It appears that Nvidia had slightly underestimated the size of the GPU die, and as a result, each GPU was considerably more expensive to manufacture. Unsurprisingly, the GPU for the Xbox's successor, the Xbox 360, was provided by Nvidia's sole remaining competitor, ATI. Now, looking back at early February and NV17 and NV25, which were of course Nvidia's two GeForce 4 chips. So that was early February 2002. In August 2002, ATI launched their 9700 Pro and delivered as promised. The performance of this card was just shocking. It was massively faster than anything Nvidia had at the time. And as we can see here, in 3D Mark 2003, the ATI card was almost 3 times faster than the Nvidia flagship. But just as FutureMark introduced its new benchmark, Nvidia initiated a public relations campaign aimed at undermining 3D Mark 03's credibility, while discouraging use of the test in the enthusiast press. Nvidia's first move was to mail out a white paper outlining its criticisms of the benchmark, while asking the press not to redistribute the document, only to paraphrase or offer excerpts. And a number of websites published articles raising question about 3D Mark 03, with in some cases unfortunately repeating Nvidia's claims about the test without attribution and without critical evaluation of those claims. Nvidia also decided not to renew its membership of the beta program, effectively pulling out of FutureMark's ecosystem. Interestingly though, the results differed from site to site. Over at HardOCP, for example, the Radeon 9700 Pro won handily, but a second set of tests with updated drivers from Nvidia showed that their new FX series of chips took a narrow lead in the overall game score. So perhaps no surprise that only a couple of months later, Nvidia were caught cheating again in 3D Mark 03. A stunning performance boost with the new Nvidia Detonator FX 44.03 drivers, which sadly came as a result of trickery and cheating. The Tech Report's author and owner at the time, Scott Wasson, was not surprised in any grand way. Nvidia has always been, top to bottom, ambitious to a fault. Intentional deception of the press, the enthusiast community, add-in board partners, consumers and shareholders with these kind of tricks is nothing less than what they would expect from the company. If they don't like us writing such things about them, then they should stop behaving as they do. I covered this whole 3D Mark 03 cheating scandal in my Cheats, Lies and Video Games video. FutureMark Corporation themselves released a 7-page audit report outlining Nvidia's cheating methods, before a few days later changing their mind with the claim that no, Nvidia really didn't cheat. After all, nothing at all suspicious about that. A week or two later, it was discovered that Nvidia was also cheating in 3D Mark 2001 SE. This would not be the last time that Nvidia was caught cheating the benchmarks. Now, over the next few years, things started to quieten down a bit. Nvidia launched SLI in 2004, and in 2005 they were chosen for the PlayStation 3. But in the main, allegations of cheating or wrongdoing appeared to have subsided. However, this was simply the lull before the storm, as we moved in to 2006. And an article over at consumerist.com, did Nvidia hire online actors to promote their products? Now, the story behind this was that certain posters at various gaming websites, for example, Elite Bastards and Beyond 3D, had made claims that Nvidia, in cooperation with the Arbuthnot Entertainment Group, or AEG, had seeded various gaming and PC hardware enthusiast sites with pro-Nvidia shills. AEG would hire employees to create personas in various gaming communities who were asked to slowly build up the trust of other members by frequently posting general hardware information to later cash in on that trust, talking up the positive qualities of Nvidia's products. The consumerist emailed David Higham of Nvidia, who passed on their questions to Derek Perez, at the time Nvidia's public relations director. And we can see over at AEG that they serve clients such as Microsoft Game Studios, Nvidia, 2K Games and Warner Brothers. And scrolling down, we do indeed see Nvidia's Derek Perez claiming that AEG serves a pivotal role in helping us build and manage online buzz for Nvidia products, and that AEG's online community outreach programs have been extraordinarily successful in improving public perception of our company and its products. When Consumerist asked David, has Nvidia hired any companies, including AEG, to do this sort of undisclosed viral marketing? Mr. Perez responded by saying maybe it's best to talk about this on the phone. 5 days later, the Consumerist was still waiting on that phone call. During this whole sordid affair, more and more posters, most of them very well known on forums such as Beyond 3D, told this story of being approached by Nvidia to become a member of their focus group. And one of the rewards for being a member of the focus group was that Nvidia sometimes gave them hardware for testing purposes. And the biggest problem was the lack of disclosure. By giving away free hardware to fans who are not required to disclose that gift, Nvidia created a precarious situation for the communities in which those fans were involved. Who is getting free hardware from Nvidia, and who is simply a fan of the product based on its own merit, making it difficult for us to trust the greater Nvidia fan community at large. The very program Nvidia instigated to take advantage of goodwill itself poisons the trust they might otherwise have had in their fan community. And perhaps most damningly, when a consumerist reader spoke to AEG, they flat out told the reader that AEG actively seeks influential members of message boards to approach for membership in their marketing program, and that these members are required to sign an NDA about the program's very existence. With the recent news being, Nvidia was now offering 30-inch widescreen LCD TVs as part of the program. Now after this, Derek finally called and, as you may expect, denied all of it. What exactly transpired here is obviously a massive story and one for a future video. Consumer unfriendly shenanigans were not enough to prevent Forbes from naming Nvidia 2007 Company of the Year, with the company also achieving its first quarter of $1 billion revenue. And moving on to 2008 and Nvidia's latest scheme for gaining graphics dominance with the acquisition of Aegea, the developer of PhysX. The acquisition was complete in February, and it took only 4 months before accusations of cheating once again in 3D Mark and Nvidia violating Future Mark's rules with their latest PhysX drivers, this time in 3D Mark Vantage, which had a test based on the Aegea physics API, which was all well and good until Nvidia bought Aegea. You can probably figure out what that was all about, but worse still, in 2009, Nvidia made the decision to disable PhysX if your system also included an ATI GPU. Back then, you may have had a separate Nvidia card just to run PhysX, even if your main card was an ATI GPU. At this time, ATI GPUs were very compelling. They had a massive performance per watt advantage, but games with PhysX did not run particularly well on ATI GPUs. The fix for this was fairly simple. You only needed to run a lower-end Nvidia card to gain the full benefits of PhysX. That was until Nvidia decided to disable it in the presence of the ATI GPU. One of the article comments saying, "I think someone is jealous," or perhaps even Nvidia. Nvidia, having run out of valid excuses, as they often do, blamed somebody else. This time, it was all AMD's fault, but that was simply a precursor to the main event. When in July 2010, over at Real World Technologies, and the highly respected David Cantor, who, in an incredibly in-depth article, discovered that PhysX, when run on the CPU, chose the slower x87 code path. And he states that PhysX uses x87 because Aegea and now Nvidia want it that way. The sole purpose of PhysX is a competitive differentiator to make Nvidia's hardware look good and sell more GPUs. And part of that is making sure that Nvidia GPUs look a lot better than the CPU, since that is what they claimed in their marketing. And using x87 definitely makes the GPU look better, since the CPU will perform worse than if the code were properly generated to use packed SSE instructions instead. Bottom line, Nvidia is free to hobble PhysX on the CPU by using single-threaded x87 code if they wish. That choice, however, does not benefit developers or consumers. Again, another Nvidia scandal. Some were less forgiving than others, but they all came to the same conclusion. Physics simply runs better on GPU because Nvidia chose to run it on the older, slower, deprecated x87 instruction set instead of SSE2. And with Nvidia incorporating strategic barriers in its drivers to prevent physics running when an ATI card is in the system, it's not exactly difficult to believe that Nvidia's acquisition of AGEA was simply to wield PhysX as an unfair weapon with no great technical use behind it. Heading back to 2008, which as you will see, Nvidia helped to make a truly awful year for consumers. Worst of all were those plagued by the buggy Nvidia drivers on Microsoft's new Vista operating system. Those of you who were paying attention to the industry back 2007-2008 will remember that Vista was pilloried as an absolutely terrible operating system. It was only months later though that we realised that 28.8% of all crashes were caused by Nvidia. These numbers came from Microsoft themselves as part of their Vista-capable lawsuit. Also in early 2008, Nvidia mounted a sleaze attack on Intel in a presentation labelled Intel Graphics.pdf. Another sneaky below-the-belt presentation from a company known for it. At least this time, they didn't pick on a tiny competitor like Hercules. And back to the GPU's terrible year in 2008 and the Ubisoft title Assassin's Creed. And over at Rage 3D where they found something quite curious in that Assassin's Creed appeared to be the very first DX 10.1 title. So Assassin's Creed employed an advanced engine with both a DX9 and a DX10 pathway, with the DX10 being faster, according to Ubisoft themselves. And looking at the benchmark, including Windows Service Pack 1, which was required to take advantage of DX 10.1, and the discovery that ATI cards gained up to 25% performance improvement under the DX 10.1 render path. Furthermore, the anti-aliasing quality had improved, so not just an improvement in performance, but also an improvement in image quality. Now, other websites of course caught wind of this and did their own testing, over at PCGH, where they basically found the exact same thing. Along this blue edge, we can quite clearly see the higher quality anti-aliasing, the ATI card at the top, and Nvidia's 8800 GT at the bottom. Clearly the AMD card doing a better job of anti-aliasing, but we see looking at their benchmarks that the 8800 GT was well ahead. One reason for that was of course the 8800 GT was a faster card. However, with Vista Service Pack 1 installed, the ATI card actually gaining performance with DirectX 10.1. So again, we see better image quality and better performance for the ATI card. But soon afterwards, the Assassin's Creed developer Ubisoft pulled the DirectX 10.1 patch and said there would be no support for it going forward. Now obviously this was quite a concerning move, and going back to 2002 when Nvidia launched their famous The Way It's Meant to Be Played initiative, which they claimed was an effort to encourage game developers to fully exploit the power of the GPU, but in fact was mostly used as a way to gain exclusivity in certain high-profile titles, like for example Assassin's Creed, made this look extremely suspicious. And of course yet another scandal. And in the larger tech press, the accusation simply was that Nvidia had forced Ubisoft to remove DX 10.1 support because it improved performance on their competitors' cards. Ubisoft responded saying no, look, it was simply just a bug that caused it. More testing was done. Nvidia denied exerting any influence on Ubisoft, with Ubisoft claiming that The Way It's Meant to Be Played was strictly a co-marketing deal and that Nvidia did not pay Ubisoft any money as a result of it. By this point, there was a strong suspicion that The Way It's Meant to Be Played was really an effort to encourage game developers to fully exploit the power of Nvidia GPUs, even if that meant ignoring better performance on their competitors' more modern DX 10.1 hardware. Still in 2008, and allegations of Nvidia and their major competitor ATI conspiring to fix prices. This one actually went back to the 1st of December 2006 when the Justice Department subpoenaed AMD and Nvidia. Now the reason for AMD's involvement is that they had just acquired ATI technologies. But in 2007, at least 51 separate complaints were lumped together and amended into a single class action lawsuit against Nvidia and ATI, alleging that the companies conducted numerous secret meetings and communications in which they conspired to fix, raise, maintain and stabilise prices of GPUs sold in the United States. Much Much of the evidence revolved around an email exchange between Nvidia's Dan Vivoli and Dave Orton of ATI, with a rather damning email from Vivoli to Orton saying, "I really think we should work harder together on the marketing front. As you and I have talked about, even though we are competitors, we have the common goal of making our category, that's GPU, a well-positioned, respected playing field. $5 and $8 stocks are a result of no respect." And another chestnut from Vivoli suggested collusion. "Both of us have spent the last 3 years trying to bring the perceived value of our products up to the level of Intel," finishing with, "It will tear down what we have both built." It didn't help that the defence lawyers for both ATI and Nvidia tried to keep these particular emails sealed as a trade secret, but that didn't sit too well with the presiding judge. A few weeks later, Nvidia settled their price-fixing lawsuit, agreeing to pay $850,000 into a $1.7 million fund, with the remainder coming from AMD. Price-fixing? Collusion? Nvidia had moved on to another level. Yet we are still in 2008, and a major story breaking at the Inquirer: why Nvidia's chips are defective. Now, this was indeed a long and complex story, but the gist of it was Nvidia had designed seriously flawed graphics chips, with the defective parts appearing to make up the entire line of Nvidia 65nm and 55nm process GPUs, without exception. And there were field reports of specific parts hitting up to 40% early life failure. Laptops were worst affected, with every major OEM, including Apple, Dell, HP, caught up in Nvidia's mistake. And in this obscure video, we hear Nvidia's CEO, Jensen Huang, saying this about the controversy.
The problem is, if you have this problem, what do? You either let the consumer work it out with the OEM, or you say this. I go to the OEM and I tell the OEM, let's fix that. No questions asked. Let's just go solve it. In fact, I'll put a reserve in place so that if you were to solve it, I'll pay you back. Now, I just sold a chip for $20, and I might have to spend $200 to help repair a notebook. Just think about that for a second. Nobody has ever done that. Nobody has ever done that. Marvell's never done that, and they've had issues. Broadcom's never. They've had issues. This particular issue is pretty industry-wide known, and the reason for that is I just don't want the consumers to have to fight the process. And so, if you take a look at the number of chips that we've shipped, it's in millions, in hundreds of millions. And if you just did the math that I just talked about, we're talking about a very small percentage. I just wanted to make sure that we put it out there that if a consumer wants it repaired, they should get it repaired.
Nvidia's CEO Jensen Huang, as you heard, a real champion of the consumer. It didn't really go hand in hand with the lawsuit claiming that Nvidia tried to hide the serious flaw in their graphics chips for at least 8 months, and after the problem was outed, immediately went on the offence, blaming the laptop makers and basically anybody except themselves. A couple of years later though, and the Bumpgate class action lawsuit was settled, and this cost Nvidia hundreds of millions of dollars. You wonder why you can't get Nvidia in Apple today? Here is one of the major reasons. After the settlement, Nvidia of course denied and continued to deny all allegations of wrongdoing or liability whatsoever, and was only agreeing to the settlement solely because it will eliminate burden, expense, management distraction and uncertainties of further litigation. Finishing off Nvidia's Annus Horribilis of 2008, and they frowned pretty hard when XFX, until then an exclusive Nvidia partner, announced that they were now also an official AMD technology partner. XFX would also begin selling AMD's famous HD 4000 series graphics cards, alongside its Nvidia lineup. Around this time, AMD's Radeon cards were extremely highly sought after, and Nvidia's partners were beginning to look at AMD's increasing market share, but XFX should have known that Nvidia is a jealous, envious partner. And less than 2 years later, Hard OCP learned that XFX were getting the boot from Nvidia, with the rumour that Nvidia will let it officially be known that XFX's European operations will cease to be an Nvidia-approved partner, which basically meant that XFX would no longer get allocation of Nvidia's newest Fermi graphics cards. And a few months later, enough was enough, with XFX Europe aligning themselves exclusively with AMD from that point onward. You remember the Assassin's Creed DX 10.1 controversy, and the main reason this came around was that Nvidia's cards were not DirectX 10.1 capable, and the reason for that was, after their famous 8000 series, Nvidia decided to take it just a little bit too easy, and simply rebranded those graphics cards over and over and over, culminating in the GTS 250, which was a rebadged 9800 GTX Plus. And over at Anintech they explain it pretty well. In the beginning there was the GeForce 8800 GT and we were happy, and then there was a faster version, the 8800 GTS 5112MB. But then it got complicated and there was a bunch of rebranding came after that. And over the page, Derek Wilson's Why Nvidia Did This, Nvidia has flagship GPUs, very large GPUs at very high prices, but they didn't have anything to cover the mid-range and below. And as I mentioned before, AMD's 4000 series, the RV770 chip, this was a much smaller graphics chip, making it far more affordable and cheaper. And in order to compete with that, Nvidia had to rely on its last generation flagship GPUs. And rather than continue to ship products with old names to vendors and customers, Nvidia slaps a new name on an old GPU and hopes to at least provide the appearance of being just as agile and competitive as AMD, despite being clearly caught off guard. With Anintech saying, Nvidia's take on this is flawed in that it treats customers like idiots. You remember Nvidia's FUD campaign on the Cairo 2? Very old designs, and developers were working on Nvidia GPUs. Just like back in the days of the GeForce 4 MX, Nvidia's large market share and backward hardware was simply holding back game development. But as long as their customers kept buying these rebadged, rebranded, older graphics cards, Nvidia probably thought they were justified in treating their customers like idiots. On a personal level, the 9800 GT was the very last Nvidia card I ever bought for myself. This period was covered in my innovation versus rebranding video, and that's a video that explains the reason for why the graphics card market is the way it is today. In 2009, AMD launched the world's first 40nm GPU and sold it as the Radeon HD 4770. And as with every other graphics card, the chip was manufactured at theirs and Nvidia's partner, TSMC. A few months later, they shocked the world with the HD 5870, DirectX 11, Infinity and Serious Speed. It was a fantastic card, but everybody in the press was waiting on Nvidia's DX11 40nm response in the form of their Fermi architecture. And we waited, and we waited, and we waited. Meanwhile, in January 2010, AMD had shipped its 2 millionth DirectX 11 compliant GPU. Meanwhile, Nvidia, in February, were happily blaming TSMC for a sales shortfall, claiming that 40nm was constrained around the world. And then finally, at the end of March, 6 months after AMD had launched their 5870 graphics card, and a massive 11 months after AMD had launched their 4770 on the same TSMC 40nm process, Nvidia finally launched their Fermi architecture in the form of the GTX 480 and GTX 470. Was it worth the wait? No, probably not. AMD continued to sell millions upon millions of GPUs, having shipped 16 million HD 5000 series alone by the middle of 2010. Nvidia, 2 months later, they just blamed TSMC for Fermi's failures. As Semi-Accurate put it, this is not to say that TSMC didn't have problems with their 40nm, they did. But if this was TSMC's problem, then everybody out there would have been effective, and yet for some reason, ATI wasn't. And none of the FPGA guys were either. In over a year of following the TSMC 40nm and Nvidia's 40nm problems, they had talked to dozens of engineers, fab workers and related designers working on TSMC's process, and none had mentioned TSMC as being the problem. Nvidia's Fermi was a failed architecture, but it certainly wasn't the fault of TSMC. But as you've already seen, Nvidia never takes the blame. Now, Nvidia's Fermi architecture was a disaster, but not all of the cards were absolutely awful. And the GTX 460, coming in at $200, competed well against AMD's fairly mediocre 5830 graphics card. And again, this was the middle of 2010. But due to Fermi's 6-month delay, AMD's next generation architectures were coming up fast, starting off with BARTs and the HD 6870 and 6850. It was clear that this new series of graphics cards would put severe pressure on Nvidia's GTX 460. But Nvidia is a company that will never allow themselves to be beaten. They weren't about to let AMD launch these cards into a clear-cut market. The 460 was only 3 months old and garnering great reviews, and their reps were making a concerted effort to let the press know 3 things that they felt were very important for their readership readership to know at this time. First of all, Nvidia was announcing massive, and what they claim to be permanent, price drops on the GTX 460 and 470. Secondly, they wanted us to know that the factory overclocked EVGA 460 for the Win Edition card comes with an 850 MHz core clock, 4000 MTs a second GDDR5 data rate, and is available for $250. And finally, Nvidia wanted us to know that the reference clocks for the GTX 460 are essentially obsolete. 3 months after launching their GTX 460, Nvidia claimed the clock speeds were obsolete. And instead of benchmarking the reference 460s provided to the tech press 3 months previously, the press should instead benchmark the new Radeons against factory overclocked GeForce GTX 460 cards instead. Now, Toms were reluctant to agree to anything of the sort. However, after checking some clock speeds of cards available over at Newegg, they concluded that 708 MHz was a fair speed to test the GTX 460 at. A 33 MHz increase over the original reference clock. You remember back to the Cairo 2 hit piece, right? When Nvidia called out Hercules for supplying 175 MHz boards to reviewers on cards spec'd to run at 166 MHz, that was a 5% increase on the Cairo 2's clock speeds. Meanwhile, over at the Anantech 6870 and 6850 review, checking out Nvidia's 6870 competitor, and we see the EVGA GTX 460 superclocked for the win. And while Anantech was including that card, they didn't believe Nvidia was taking the right action here. Pushing factory overclock cards may give Nvidia a competitive product, but it's being done in a way they can't approve of. Now, putting this as simple as possible, when a new graphics card was launched, the tech press would receive the reference card. Reference spec, reference coolers, direct from Nvidia or AMD. This is how it was done for years. And when a new reference card came out, it would be benchmarked against its competitor's reference card as well. With this one move, Nvidia had essentially hijacked AMD's product launch with a spoiler graphics card having a massive 26% core overclock and an 11% memory overclock compared to the reference card. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this heavily overclocked GTX 460 was in some cases capable of beating even the 6870, and in fact ran very close to Nvidia's own GTX 470. But the reality of this card was it struggled to compete with the HD 6850 while consuming more power and having a much larger die size than the 6870. Suffice it to say that this move caused a great deal of controversy, and overnight there was an uproar on the Anantech forum. So bad that Anand himself had to respond with an article, "Your feedback on the use of EVGA's GeForce 460 for the win" in last night's review. And Anand says, "Let's start with the obvious. Nvidia is more aggressive than AMD with trying to get review sites to use certain games and even make certain GPU comparisons." And Nvidia had of course called asking for them to include the overclocked GTX 460s in the 6800 series article. And while Anantech gave Nvidia no impression that they would include the card, despite Nvidia's insistence, they went ahead and included it anyway. A graphics card with a massive 26% overclock over the reference card. And Nvidia happy to tear up the unwritten rules of benchmarking because they simply could not lose. And many in the tech press disgraced themselves while selling consumers short. Nvidia's Fermi architecture was pretty much a disaster, but they did actually fix it fairly well with the release of their 500 series graphics cards. A few months after the ill-fated 480 launched, Nvidia then launched the GTX 580. Power consumption was better, they were now selling the whole GPU instead of a cut-down version, and they'd managed to increase the clock speeds at the same time. It was a much better graphics card, but obviously Nvidia must have been very worried about AMD's upcoming 6900 graphics cards. But they had taken preemptive action to ensure the 580 would be seen in the best possible light. And with the tech report entering into disputed territory, as the developers of Hawks 2, which was a "the way it's meant to be played" title that made extensive use of DirectX 11 tessellation. Now Fermi was very good at one thing, and it was DX11 tessellation. The Hawks 2 developers had built a GPU benchmarking tool based on the game, a game which hadn't even been released. And in advance of that, Nvidia had provided the press with a standalone copy of the benchmark tool. Now AMD had caught wind of this and released their own statement to the press, saying that it has come to their attention that they may have received an early build of a benchmark based on the upcoming Ubisoft title Hawks 2. I'm sure that you're fully aware that the timing of this benchmark is not coincidental and is an attempt by your competitor to negatively influence your reviews of the AMD Radeon HD 6800 series products. And AMD suggested that the press do not use this benchmark at present, as it has known issues with its implementation of tessellation. And what appears to be a sensible final paragraph saying that a quick comparison of the performance data in Hawks 2 with tessellation on, and that of other games and benchmarks, will demonstrate how unrepresentative Hawks 2 performance is of real-world performance. Now, if we look at the tech report's result of the game Aliens vs Predator 1080p, we can see that their heavily overclocked GTX 460 810MHz core clock just beats out the HD 6870 by 1 frame per second, 3 frames per second in Metro, while the HD 6870 wins fairly handsomely, albeit at a higher resolution, in Battlefield Bad Company 2. Meanwhile, in the Hawks 2 benchmark, the 460 is 50% faster than the HD 6870. So I'll let you make up your mind on that one, but you probably understand that if a publication only benchmarks 5 or 6 games, the 6870 could win all of them by a couple of frames per second, except for one, for example Hawks 2, where it loses heavily, and the final numbers will show that the GTX 460, overclocked, is a faster graphics card. Even when Nvidia lost, they always had a way to win. And every time it meant a bad result for you, because the vast majority of games, the 6870 was a faster graphics card. But with their way it's meant to be played program, Nvidia were always capable of winning, even when they lost. Early 2012, and Nvidia's partner TSMC once again on the receiving end of a kicking from Nvidia. Nvidia were deeply unhappy with TSMC's 20nm, claiming it was essentially worthless. Over at Extreme Tech, they point out that one of the unspoken rules of customer-foundry relations is that you virtually never see the former speak poorly of the latter. Now, as you saw with Nvidia's 40nm claims, this probably doesn't include Nvidia, and they went on to diss TSMC's 20nm process in this bizarre presentation at the International Trade Partner Conference. What was most surprising about this was Nvidia's remarks concerning TSMC's current cost curves and manufacturing ramps, because this is normally the sort of information discussed quietly between a foundry and its customers. And looking over some of these slides, what partners do, how they share profit and loss, the end goal, share and safeguard each other's information, understand each other's real needs, capabilities and constraints, going on and on to finally compromising on rough justice over a long period. And here we see Nvidia sharing each other's information while not exactly safeguarding TSMC's manufacturing secrets. Nvidia showing the projected transistor cost of TSMC's 20nm process, crying that 20 and 14nm cost barely goes below the previous one. There are no cost savings. Now, you may think that this must be a deliberate decision by TSMC and it has nothing to do with the laws of physics, but you'd be wrong. And over at SemiWiki we see Daniel Nenny's response and some points to ponder. Number one being, why was this presented at a press conference versus a technical conference? And as we know today, the media did say that GPUs would be skipped for 20nm, instead moving directly to 16nm. So really, what actually happened to the 20nm GPUs? The answer to that was simple. After 28nm, FinFETs were required to maintain high performance GPUs, and those only came at 16nm. Nvidia, as always, happy to blame somebody else, even their closest long-term partners. Please be warned that the following 20 seconds are not safe for work.
Because Nvidia tries to sell chips, a lot of chips, into the Android market. And Nvidia has been the single worst company we've ever dealt with. So Nvidia, fuck you.
Early 2013, and AMD claims that former executives handed trade secrets to Nvidia, with the allegation that former managers copied 100,000 confidential files before joining the Green Team, with the files including obviously confidential, proprietary and or trade secret materials relating to developing technology and or highly confidential business strategy. You can find the lawsuit and the restraining order placed on the three, but as the tech report reported, the damage may already have been done. Late 2013, and Nvidia's latest ploy, GameWorks, a collection of tools, samples and libraries to help developers bring their creations to life, like for example PhysX, and a bunch of technologies making heavy use of tessellation. Early GameWorks titles were plagued with performance problems and glitches, but the whole thing came to a head in 2015 when AMD claimed that GameWorks completely sabotaged their performance on Witcher 3, with AMD's Richard Huddy saying they had been working with CD Projekt from the beginning, but then around about 2 months before release or thereabouts, the GameWorks code arrived with Hairworks and it completely sabotaged AMD's performance. And the benchmarks showed that this was indeed the case. The GTX 980 suffered a performance hit from 87 down to 62 frames per second with Hairworks on. AMD's competing R9 290X, however, saw a capitulation in frame rate down from 76 to 29 frames per second, simply by the inclusion of one Nvidia technology. The biggest problem here? At the time, GameWorks was a black box. All of these technologies, while capable of running on AMD hardware, could not be optimized by the developers or AMD themselves. GameWorks simply took PhysX and tessellation to the next level of unfair advantage, all for some dubious gains in image quality at the cost of massive frame rate. So long as it hurt AMD cards more though, it was a net win for Nvidia. September 2014 and Nvidia launches their GeForce GTX 980 and 970 graphics cards. Based on their excellent Maxwell architecture, these cards were extremely well received. And looking at the specs, we can see that the GTX 970 was what we call a cut down version of the GTX 980. Slightly slower clock speeds and 25% less CUDA cores, it did however retain the same number of ROPs as the GTX 980, which effectively meant that the memory subsystem was the same as the GTX 980. Or at least, that's what Nvidia told the tech press. A month or so later, and 1 or 2 reports were coming in of the GTX 970 suffering stutters in certain games at certain resolutions, with one user over at the GeForce forum saying, while playing Shadow of Mordor, whenever Ultra HD textures were enabled, he got constant stutters. Curiously, his VRAM usage is only 3.5GB. It never goes to 4GB of VRAM and he doesn't know why. And he has friends that has a 970 GTX too, and their VRAM usage was similar. However, the GTX 980 goes to 4GB of VRAM usage. What happened next went down in history, while spawning a myriad of memes. Finally, at the end of January 2015, Nvidia disclosed the full memory structure and limitations of the GTX 970. It was a 4GB card, however, that last half gigabyte of memory does run slower than the first 3.5GB, and it was a lot slower. Essentially what Nvidia had done was, as well as simply disabling the CUDA cores, they had also disabled a crossbar connection to the L2 cache. And the claim of 64 ROPs and the 2MB of L2 cache should in fact have been 56 ROPs and 1.8MB of L2. The fallout came quickly. And over at Hexus, where punches weren't being pulled, we've learned that the GTX 970 is more than a core-reduced version of the GTX 980, which is a fact that will come into play once that final half gigabyte is routinely accessed. We've learned that Nvidia has chosen not to impart the GTX 970's differences until internet rumours surfaced on a potential memory bandwidth issue. And we have learned that Nvidia has known all along that the information passed along to reviewers, ROP counts, L2 cache, etc., has been wrong and has done nothing about it until forced to do so when speculation grew too rife. The next day, Nvidia updated the specifications of the GeForce GTX 970. And finally, their CEO Jensen Huang wrote an open letter to the company's customers with the claim that the company simply failed to communicate how the memory subsystem works on the GeForce GTX 970. And although Mr. Huang admitted that the card's memory subsystem works rather oddly, he didn't reveal why the company incorrectly stated the amount of raster operation pipelines, that's ROPs, as being 64 instead of the correct number of 56, and also the same with the L2 cache. Mr. Huang's response being, unfortunately, we failed to communicate this internally to our marketing team and externally to reviewers at launch. Nvidia, however, offered no compensation to their customers. And as we've seen before, what Nvidia claimed and what the reality was generally differs. And looking at the GTX 970, using the GPU-Z tool, we can quite clearly see the 64 ROPs. Now GPU-Z takes this information from Nvidia's drivers, so the question here would be, if the 64 ROP claim was simply a miscommunication between engineering and marketing, then surely this number should have been 56 ROPs. You would think that at a company like Nvidia, it's their engineers that would be writing their drivers. So why does this say 64 ROPs instead of 56? A few months later, Nvidia had settled a class action lawsuit over the GTX 970's 3.5GB memory, offering a measly $30 to all GTX 970 customers. It's the middle of 2015 and DirectX 12 had arrived at last. And with that arrival, arrived yet another controversy. There had long been rumours that AMD cards would perform better under DirectX 12 compared to DirectX 11. So when the first DirectX 12 game, Ashes of the Singularity, showed a result where the Fury X was on par, and in some cases even ahead of the GTX 980 Ti, with the 980 Ti generally winning most other games, it perhaps wasn't all that surprising to see. But perhaps even less surprising was that Nvidia really didn't think very much of Ashes of the Singularity, saying they did not believe that Ashes was a good indicator of overall DX12 performance, while also telling reviewers that MSAA performance was buggy in the game and that reviewers should disable it when benchmarking the title. The game developer Oxide, however, denied this characterization of the benchmark in no uncertain terms, assuring everyone that there is no bug in their MSAA implementation, while noting that their code had been reviewed by Nvidia, Microsoft, AMD and Intel, and it had passed the very thorough D3D validation system provided by Microsoft. And Oxide's analysis indicated that any DirectX 12 problems are actually quite mundane. It's all about the new API and new drivers. Nvidia's attempt once again to discredit a game where their performance was not up to scratch was of course discussed heavily on forums during August. And over at OCN forums, a poster by the name of Kolok, a developer for Oxide Games, describing what happened between Nvidia and Oxide, said this: "I believe the initial confusion was because Nvidia PR was putting pressure on us to disable certain settings in the benchmark, and when we refused, I think they took it a little too personally." Nvidia had asked the Ashes developers to disable asynchronous compute, which was an unmitigated disaster in terms of performance on their Maxwell graphics cards. Note that Nvidia's request was to disable asynchronous compute, not disable asynchronous compute on Nvidia hardware. And I'm sure you know where this one ends up, but a few months later, and AMD were clobbering Nvidia in the updated Ashes of the Singularity DX12 benchmark, complete with asynchronous compute. The Fury X now easily defeating the GTX 980 Ti. But once again, Nvidia had proven that they were willing to sacrifice their competitors' performance, gamers' performance, if that meant that they looked better. And when the game developers rightly refused to disable asynchronous compute, Nvidia fell back on their usual FUD and another pack of lies to the tech press. In the past, when Nvidia developed a graphics chip, for example this massive GTX 280, codenamed GT200, the flagship card would have been the whole chip, and in the case of GT200, that flagship was the GTX 280. The GTX 270, however, also contained the GT200 graphics chip. However, rather than being the whole chip, it had 25% of it fused off, basically for segmentation purposes. With 25% less cores, the graphics card should have been around about 20 to 25% slower. And generally speaking, this is how it was always done. When parts of the chip get fused off, that chip was now part of a different graphics card. This all changed in September 2016 when Nvidia launched their GTX 1060 3GB. The GTX 1060 was based on the Pascal GP106 and at first launched as a 6GB version. Nvidia, however, soon launched a GTX 1060 3GB, except it wasn't really a GTX 1060. As we can see here over at Nvidia.com, Nvidia had given the same GTX 1060 name for a card with a graphics chip with fused off CUDA cores. As Gamers Nexus put it on the naming choice, this isn't a lower VRAM GTX 1060, it's a different card. And the GTX 1060 3GB should absolutely not be called a GTX 1060. Nvidia's choice to name the card as such will confuse buyers into thinking it's just a 1060 with half the VRAM, which is plainly false. But not all in the tech press were as critical as Gamers Nexus, and it wasn't long before Nvidia were caught sneaking in a slower GeForce MX 150 variant into some ultrabooks. The same name, two different chips, but users can generally expect a significant performance drop of about 20 to 25% between the two versions. Notebook check ending with, be careful which notebooks you buy with the GeForce MX 150. In my opinion, you'd be better off avoiding them altogether. But not everybody in the tech press had a go at Nvidia. So 1 month later, they quietly rolled out a slower GeForce GT 130 with DDR4. Two graphics cards with the same name, yet one of them has less than half the memory bandwidth. 1 month later, in May, and Nvidia released the GeForce GTX 1050 3GB with more RAM and fewer ROPs. I guess we should be grateful that this time they actually did declare the correct number of ROPs, though quite why we needed a GTX 1050 3GB with less ROPs than the GTX 1050 2GB is anyone's guess. By this point, if you're thinking Nvidia are simply just taking the piss, you're probably not that far away from reality. And finally, Nvidia's final, or should I say, latest crime against PC gaming when they launched their GeForce Partner Program, which impacted consumer choice. According to Nvidia, the GeForce Partner Program would help gamers to know what they are buying, which is pretty rich coming from a company who you just witnessed pulling all of those naming stunts with their GTX 1060, 1050s, 1030s and MX 150s. But Nvidia, in their latest effort to better serve gamers, introduced the GPP, using the word transparency 4 times in what was quite a short blog post. Nvidia claimed that the program wasn't exclusive and partners continue to have the ability to sell and promote products from anyone. But over at Hard OCP, they told the real story here. And in discussions with certain Nvidia partners, it was pretty clear that none of them had any real choice. They either agreed to align their gaming brands with Nvidia's GeForce brand or risk losing access to Nvidia's engineers and co-marketing efforts. GPP meant that companies like Asus, MSI and Gigabyte had to create a separate brand for their AMD graphics cards, while Nvidia kept the gaming branding, for example Republic of Gamers, and in many cases the tech press simply could not find any information on the GPP. A bit later on, however, it became clear Nvidia's partners were afraid to talk about it, as this could have been dangerous to their company, and for once the storm simply would not abate. And in early May, Nvidia were forced, finally, to pull the plug on GPP, still claiming it was simply all about buyers having a clear choice and still using that transparent word. For Nvidia, for now and for always, this is the way it is meant to be played. So let's finish this one off with a recap. I decided to call this video Nvidia anti-competitive, anti-consumer and anti-technology, just the same as I did with my Intel video 10 months ago. And if we go back to the early days when they were being sued and the way that Nvidia dealt with all of that, many of you will say, well, that is simply business. And I would not disagree with you there. There is some question over whether or not these lawsuits were actually valid. There are arguments from both sides. The whole point of this whole period though was to show just how merciless Nvidia was, and it did not matter about the size of the company, whether that was tiny little Hercules or a sleaze attack on Intel. And this for me is actually quite an important point when it comes to the whole anti-competitive thing. Generally speaking, I am happy for companies to have a go at each other. Let them have a go at each other by all means. The problems arise though when a larger company is having a go at a smaller company in order to basically force them out of the game. And this is where we see the real anti-competitive nature of Nvidia. All of this stuff, disabling PhysX in the presence of an ATI GPU. Nvidia bought AGI in order to wield PhysX as a weapon. That was all they were interested in, and we saw them do the exact same thing later on with GameWorks. All of this stuff is anti-competitive. There's talk of publishers forcing their game developers to use GameWorks. Now, where did that come from? They obviously didn't make that decision by themselves. And if money's not changing hands, then, why else would you take that decision? Is it because Nvidia has the commanding market share, meaning that developers and publishers simply cannot say no? If that is the case, then we are in a serious anti-competitive situation, and anti-competitive behaviour becomes even more of a problem the closer a company gets to a monopoly. And today, Nvidia, I would say, are effectively a monopoly on PC gaming. But the next thing to look at would be anti-consumer behaviour. All that cheating they did in 3D Mark. All of the tech press back then were using 3D Mark. 3D Mark was the major benchmark for years and years. Nvidia simply could not allow themselves to lose that, so they cheated version after version after version. This is anti-consumer because you got the wrong impression of their graphics card capabilities. And moving on to to this whole thing about recruiting Nvidia fans while giving them hardware without any disclosure. Now, this is really anti-consumer stuff. People go to forums, they expect to read opinion and get accurate information based on a person's experience with that product, a person who actually bought the product and not one who was given it for free. There was a time back then where maybe it was a witch hunt in fact, but this caused a massive fallout because people on forums could no longer trust anything that they were reading, and it was Nvidia who started this. Does it still happen today? What do you think? All this rebranding that they did in the early and late 2000s, Nvidia has in fact been rebranding throughout their history, and this is simply an anti-consumer move. If you buy a 9800 GT, you expect it to be quite a bit faster than an 8800 GT, not what is basically the exact same card. But over time we simply accepted it. It wasn't accepted 10 years ago though, at least not to the extent of which Nvidia pushed it. This was anti-consumer, and they were simply treating their customers like idiots. GTX 970 3.5GB, another move as anti-consumer as you will find anywhere today. And what's more, they dragged the tech press into it as well. Different versions of the same named graphics card. That's simply anti-consumer. You see a benchmark of an MX 150 performing at a certain level. You then go buy a laptop with an MX 150, except it's actually 25% slower than what you expect to get. How can that not be anti-consumer? Of course it's anti-consumer. Nvidia has fooled you into buying a slower part by giving it the same name as a faster part. But it's all levels, of course, and probably the worst one is, of course, the whole price fixing thing between Nvidia and ATI, it has to be said. Although based on the emails, Nvidia did appear to be the instigator. ATI obviously disgraced themselves as well. If I ever do a video on ATI, you can be sure I'll talk about this again. This, however, is a video about Nvidia, and price fixing is indeed on a whole other level compared to all of their other anti-consumer actions. And finally we come to anti-technology, which will no doubt be a controversial statement, as it was when I made it in my Intel video too. But the reviews point it out clearly. Stuff like the GeForce 4 MX, which was anti-consumer in that it made you believe you were getting a much faster, more modern graphics card than what you actually got. What I actually got, because as I've mentioned before, I actually bought one of those GeForce 4 MXs, believing that it was just a slightly slower version than the TIs. It was in fact basically a GeForce 2 with some minor updates. This held back game development because millions upon millions of people bought that card under the same wrong impression. Ubisoft cancelling Assassin's Creed. It's almost impossible to blame Nvidia for this. We simply don't know what went on. It's just pretty curious that Ubisoft decided against 10.1 after we saw it performing and looking better on ATI hardware. You simply have to make up your mind on that based on what you believe of Nvidia as a company. Do you believe Nvidia would be capable of this? I mean, we heard from a dev themselves that Nvidia pressured them to remove asynchronous compute from ashes of the Singularity. Asynchronous compute made the game perform much worse on Nvidia hardware, but the game performed much better with AMD hardware. Yet Nvidia wanted the developer to disable it completely. Not disable it on Nvidia, disable it completely. If that's not anti-technology, then what is it? And you can look at all the other stuff as well. The way that they treat their partners is very, very telling. Ex-partners, current partners, it simply doesn't matter. They dished the dirt on SGS Thompson, their ex-partner, as soon as they had outlived their usefulness. Their current partner TSMC takes the blame every time Nvidia releases a bad graphics card. We've seen it over and over. And then most recently we saw the whole GPP thing, attempting to align their partners' branding with GeForce. We're talking some pretty big companies here. Asus, HP, Dell, how many more actually caved in and agreed to this idea? This anti-competitive, anti-consumer idea. Nvidia will drag everybody down with them until they are the only ones left standing at the top. And sadly, Nvidia will be the ones left standing at the top. As far as I'm concerned, they have already won the PC gaming market. But Nvidia is a company that will still try to take even more. They will never be content with what they have. And when the next round of graphics cards come along, maybe 2-3 months, I'm not entirely sure, Nvidia will do their best to make you want that card. But you need to ask yourself, are you better serving yourself by not giving them your money? I'll catch you later, guys.